The red appeared on Leonard Bogue's temple exactly when the violinist drew her bow across the strings for the opening note. A perfect coincidence that would have been poetic if it weren't meant to end his life. That red dot? It was ordered by Viktor Kozlov, a man who's built an empire on fraud, coercion, and murder. He kills anyone who threatens his operation, destroys families to maintain control, and believes fear makes him untouchable. If you believe criminals like Kozlov should be exposed and brought to justice, hit that subscribe button now. Only manipulators, frauds, and people who profit from others' suffering won't subscribe. Comment, expose the truth, if you stand against people who murder innocent victims to protect their empires. Now, let me tell you about the unlikely alliance that's about to destroy everything Kozlov has built. He stood near the marble bar of Manhattan's Diamond Hall, surveying 250 guests who believed themselves untouchable in their designer suits and vintage gowns. Crystal chandeliers cast amber light across polished floors below, where champagne flutes and wine glasses caught reflections like tiny prisms, revealing desires their holders preferred to keep hidden. The exclusive wine gala had transformed the venue into a temple of cultivated taste. Each attendee is a carefully selected piece. Leonard's tattooed hand remained steady on the bar's edge, his dark green suit absorbing the warmth of climate-controlled air that smelled of aged oak and expensive perfume. He'd attended this event for 8 years, each time watching fortunes change hands over bottles that most buyers couldn't properly distinguish from supermarket wine. Tonight felt different in ways he couldn't articulate. A tension beneath the refined elegance that made his instincts sharpen like a knife finding its purpose. The string quartet played Paganini, while sommelier staff circulated with precision that would shame choreographed dancers. Their trays balanced with the expertise of people who understood unspoken hierarchies. Across the room, a woman moved through the crowd with purpose that contradicted the effortless grace of her movements, her wine-red gown catching light in ways that seemed almost deliberate. She stopped at each wine display, examining bottles with fingers that suggested intimate knowledge of every vintage. Her dark hair was styled in waves that belonged in classic cinema, timeless, without trying to compete with the younger socialites who surrounded her like background extras. She consulted what appeared to be authentication notes, her attention focused with the intensity of someone conducting an investigation rather than making small talk. Leonard recognized precision when he saw it. The economy of movement that separated professionals from amateurs in every field he'd ever mastered. This woman wasn't networking for social advantage. She was executing a plan with variables only she could see and outcomes she'd already calculated 3 moves ahead. She glanced up suddenly, her eyes scanning the venue's elevated positions with the swift assessment of someone who understood that predators always chose the high ground. Their gazes met for precisely 3 seconds before she returned her attention to a Chateau Margaux display that anchored the room's western wall. The moment passed without acknowledgement. Yet something in that brief connection told Leonard she'd cataloged every detail about him. The tattoos, the watchful posture, the reputation, just as he'd begun cataloging her. He moved through the crowd with measured steps, nodding to associates whose names he remembered, but whose loyalty had long since been tested and categorized. A real estate developer intercepted him with the familiarity of someone who believed shared business deals constituted genuine connection, launching into complaints about regulatory oversight that Leonard deflected with non-committal responses. He extracted himself near a display of rare burgundies, their subtle complexity contrasting sharply with the obvious theatrics of the evening's social performances. The woman in wine red now stood beside a collection of vintage champagnes, her posture suggesting she was simultaneously engaged and observing from a distance. She spoke quietly with an elderly collector whose hands gestured animatedly toward a Dom Perignon from the 1950s, his enthusiasm authentic in a room full of calculated interest. Leonard positioned himself nearby, pretending to examine a bottle of Chateau d'Yquem that gleamed like liquid gold under the chandeliers. From this angle, he could hear fragments of the woman's voice, cultured and composed, with an accent that suggested expensive education rather than regional origin. The provenance is documented through the original Chateau records, she was saying, her tone carrying the kind of certainty that ended debates before they could begin. I've verified the bottle personally through chemical analysis and compared it against authenticated samples from the same vintage year. The collector nodded, reassured by her expertise, while Leonard noted the subtle way she'd positioned herself to observe both the main entrance and the service corridors leading to the wine cellars. Most people didn't think about exit strategies at wine galas. Most people didn't need to. A sommelier approached with vintage champagne, the bubbles rising in perfect columns that spoke to quality most guests would never consciously appreciate. Leonard accepted a glass he had no intention of drinking, using it as camouflage for the role he played in rooms like this. The woman concluded her conversation and turned, nearly colliding with him in a moment that might have been accidental if her eyes hadn't already known exactly where he stood. She stepped back with a murmured apology that carried no real regret, only the social courtesy necessary for smooth interactions. The 1947 Cheval Blanc is a forgery, she said quietly, nodding toward the bottle he'd been pretending to study, her voice pitched for his ears alone. Excellent work, but the chemical composition reveals synthetic compounds that didn't exist in the 1940s. Leonard shifted his weight imperceptibly, a movement most wouldn't notice, but that changed his angle to the room by crucial degrees that opened sightlines and tactical options. The woman watched this adjustment with eyes that understood positioning in ways that transcended wine expertise, her expression remaining pleasant while calculations ran beneath the surface. "You have exceptional knowledge, miss," he began, leaving the sentence unfinished in a way that invited completion without demanding it outright. The quartet transitioned to Vivaldi, and the crowd's conversation rose to match the tempo change, providing acoustic cover for words that needed privacy.
Jackson.
Linda Jackson, she supplied, extending a hand that bore faint calluses in unexpected places for someone whose profession seemed to require only sensory judgment and sophisticated palates. I'm the sommelier responsible for tonight's authentication process, which means I'm also responsible for admitting when bottles don't meet our advertised standards. Her handshake was firm without being aggressive, the grip of someone who understood that physical communication often revealed more than verbal exchanges ever could. Leonard held her gaze for a moment that stretched beyond politeness, finding intelligence there that made him recalibrate his initial assessment. "You're saying the auction house is selling counterfeits?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the implications that unfolded like dominoes falling. Complexity emerging from apparent simplicity. Around them, guests laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny and praised wines they couldn't accurately describe. The social machinery grinding forward with relentless momentum. Linda's smile never reached her eyes, which continued their systematic scanning of the venue's geography with the patience of someone conducting surveillance. "I'm saying that even rigorous authentication processes occasionally discover inconsistencies requiring immediate disclosure, which I plan to make before formal bidding begins in 15 minutes. She adjusted her notes under one arm, the movement drawing his attention to the tension in her shoulders that contradicted her composed demeanor. Something was wrong in ways that transcended wine fraud. A pressure building beneath the evening's polished surface like a storm gathering strength before it broke. Then she leaned closer, her perfume mixing with the scent of aged wine, her lips barely moving as she delivered words that would change everything. "Smile like it's a joke." Her voice carried just far enough for nearby guests to hear what sounded like the conclusion of an amusing anecdote. And then, barely audible beneath the quartet's swelling notes. "Red on your head." Leonard's expression didn't change, but his pulse kicked up in the way it always did when death entered the equation.
The red.
3 words that meant professional killers, 6-figure contracts, and someone who wanted him erased badly enough to risk a public venue. He maintained his casual posture at the bar, champagne glass still in hand, while his mind cataloged exits and cover positions with the speed of someone who'd survived 2 decades by being faster than the people trying to kill him. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. To anyone watching, they looked like a Mafia boss and a beautiful sommelier sharing an intimate moment over rare vintages. "3 that I've tracked," Linda replied, her lips curving into what might have been a smile if her eyes weren't scanning the room with tactical precision. "Mezzanine level overlooking the bar. That's your primary threat. Second position behind the wine cellar entrance. Redundancy in case you move toward the back exits. Third, near coat check, preventing escape through the main entrance." She adjusted her notes with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "They arrived 40 minutes ago with cases disguised as wine shipments. I recognized the discipline in how they position themselves. My father taught me that wine counterfeiters and assassins share similar operational patterns. Both hide lethal intent behind refined appearances." Leonard processed this with the cold clarity that came when survival required absolute focus. Professional hit teams cost 6 figures minimum. Someone had invested serious resources into ending him tonight. "Your father was in wine? Owned a vineyard in Napa. Jackson Estate." Her voice carried weight that transcended simple family business. "Counterfeiters destroyed him, flooded the market with fake bottles bearing his label. The stress killed him. Heart attack at 53. I learned early that this world could be as deadly as any criminal enterprise you've built." She met his gaze directly, and he saw steel beneath the elegant exterior. "Viktor Kozlov has been forcing me to authenticate counterfeit wines for his money laundering operation for 28 months. The same people who brokered the fraudulent French vintages you've been investigating. Several of their fronts operate in your territory. They believe you're a threat to their expansion. They want me dead, then eliminate you during the chaos," Leonard said, understanding the tactical sequence immediately. "Clean up both problems in one evening." Linda's hand tightened on her glass. "My sister died 8 months ago. Police ruled it a random mugging, but I found evidence of professional execution. 2 shots, center mass, suppressed weapon based on witness descriptions that didn't make the official report. Kozlov had threatened her to keep me compliant." Her voice remained steady, but something raw flickered behind her composure. "If you die tonight, I lose the only person with resources and reputation to help me destroy them. I'm hoping you're ruthless enough to survive and powerful enough to make them regret everything they've taken from me." Leonard felt the weight of her desperation, recognized it as the same force that had kept him alive when smarter men would have accepted death. "Then we'd better make sure I don't die tonight." "Move closer," Leonard said quietly, his tattooed hand finding the small of Linda's back with practiced ease. To anyone watching, the gesture looked possessive, intimate, a powerful man claiming a beautiful woman's attention. In reality, he was positioning her body to complicate the mezzanine shooter's angle, while his own back blocked the sight line entirely. "We need to look like we're enjoying each other's company." Linda leaned into him without hesitation, her hand settling on his forearm where rose tattoos climbed toward his wrist. Her fingers were warm through the fabric of his suit, and when she tilted her head toward his ear, her hair brushed his jaw. They looked like lovers sharing secrets in a crowded room. The string quartet's music provided acoustic cover, while champagne bubbles rose between them like tiny shields. "My sister had gambling debts," Linda murmured, her breath warm against his neck. "Underground casino in Brooklyn that Kozlov controlled. She thought she could win it back, kept doubling down until she owed 200,000. That's when they found me. Master sommelier, with impeccable credentials, grieving sister who'd do anything to protect family. Her hand tightened on his arm. They made me their authentication tool. Every counterfeit bottle I certified as legitimate, they forgave 5,000 of her debt. Leonard felt the mathematics of coercion clicking into place. 28 months of compliance. 40 bottles minimum, probably more. Millions in fraudulent wine sales bearing her professional seal. You've been building a case since she died. Every bottle documented, Linda confirmed, her eyes meeting his with fierce intensity despite their intimate positioning. Provenance records, lab analysis showing chemical compounds that didn't exist when these vintages were supposedly produced. Wire transfers connecting shell corporations to Kozlov's network, communications with buyers who thought they were purchasing legitimate investments. She shifted closer as a waiter passed, the movement appearing natural while maintaining their defensive posture. Evidence stored with 3 attorneys across 2 states. If I miss my scheduled check-ins, everything goes to the FBI and wine industry authorities simultaneously. Tonight's his largest transaction, Leonard said, understanding crystallizing. You were planning to blow it up. Publicly question the featured lots during the auction, trigger independent verification that would take months, and destroy his timeline. Linda's expression hardened. But then I recognized the shooters. Now I need you alive because Kozlov won't stop with threats anymore. He'll eliminate anyone I connect with, colleagues, friends, the few family members I have left. Leonard studied her face, reading the exhaustion beneath her composed exterior. 28 months of living under a sword that had already fallen once. Kozlov's been infiltrating my territory for 6 months, he said, sharing information that created partnership through mutual vulnerability. Wine bars, restaurants, fronts for laundering money through my legitimate hospitality investments. He's not just building his empire. He's corrupting mine. His tattooed hand moved to her waist, protective and possessive. If he succeeds, I lose everything I've built. Both sides of it. Linda's eyes searched his, and something shifted between them. Recognition of shared stakes, shared enemies, shared desperation masked as strength. Then we'd better make sure he fails. Linda reached for the auction catalog on the bar, her movements deliberate as she positioned it between them. Leonard leaned closer, their heads nearly touching as she turned to the featured lots. To observers, they were absorbed in each other. In reality, she was walking him through a criminal enterprise that had consumed 28 months of her life. The counterfeit wines are sophisticated, she said quietly, her finger tracing down the page to a 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc listed at a starting bid of 300,000. Fabricated provenance from prestigious French chateaux, complete with forged acquisition documents and estate records. A Luxembourg shell corporation will win tonight's bidding at exactly 1.8 million, competitive enough to appear legitimate, low enough to avoid triggering additional scrutiny. Leonard watched her finger move across the catalog, noting the tension in her hand. 1.8 million buys a lot of legitimacy. Plus auction house commission, authentication fees, insurance documentation. Linda's voice carried the clinical precision of someone who'd studied every angle. By tomorrow morning, illegal proceeds will transform into legitimate assets with paper trails that satisfy IRS audits and financial regulators. Clean money with my professional certification as the foundation. She turned the page, revealing chemical analysis reports tucked into the catalog's back pocket. Leonard's tattooed hand brushed hers as he reached for the documents, the contrast between his scarred knuckles and her elegant fingers stark under the chandelier's amber light. Their different worlds colliding over forged wine and shared enemies. The corporation traces through 5 legal entities, Linda continued, pulling out a diagram she'd hand-drawn connecting shell companies across 3 countries. But they all connect to Kozlov through a trust signed by Marcel Dubois, former wine merchant convicted of fraud in France in 2019. I've built a prosecutable case, meeting evidentiary standards. Chemical analysis showing synthetic compounds that didn't exist in the 1940s, wire transfers connecting each entity, communications with buyers who believed they were purchasing legitimate vintages. Leonard studied her work with growing respect. This wasn't amateur revenge. This was methodical warfare waged with documentation and evidence chains. You were never planning to authenticate these wines. I was going to reveal the chemical inconsistencies during the auction, Linda confirmed, her eyes meeting his with fierce determination. Halt the sale pending independent verification that would take months, trigger federal investigation into the entire operation. But that was before the shooters. She gestured subtly toward the mezzanine level, without looking up from the catalog. Now we need a strategy that neutralizes them while exposing Kozlov. Leonard understood the tactical problem immediately. Kozlov believed Linda's compliance was guaranteed by fear, threats to anyone she connected with, the implicit promise that cooperation meant survival. He didn't know about the documented evidence, the attorneys, the case she'd been building since her sister's murder. Dead leverage had created an enemy more dangerous than any living threat. He thinks he controls you, Leonard said quietly, his hand covering hers on the catalog. Their champagne glasses caught the light between them, bubbles rising like tiny witnesses to an alliance forming under impossible circumstances. That's his mistake. Linda's fingers curled around his, brief but deliberate. Let's make sure it's a fatal one. The moment I reveal the authentication problems, they'll execute, Linda said, her voice barely audible beneath the string quartet's crescendo. You first eliminate the physical threat. Then me before I can leave with the evidence. We'll both be dead before security realizes what happened. Leonard's jaw tightened, his mind racing through scenarios and countermeasures. Then something shifted in his expression, the cold calculation of someone who'd survived 2 decades by being smarter than people trying to kill him. We changed the board. Force Kozlov to choose between completing his operation and maintaining his cover. Before Linda could respond, the auctioneer took the podium, his voice carrying across the venue with practiced authority. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll direct your attention to tonight's featured collection. Leonard moved forward with confident strides that drew immediate attention. His reputation preceded him. Guests recognized the tattooed Mafia boss from tabloid photographs and whispered rumors, their conversations faltering as he approached the front. He extended his hand toward Linda, with a kind of command that didn't invite refusal. Join me. Linda's heart hammered against her ribs, but she took his hand, understanding immediately what he was doing. Maximum visibility. Witnesses everywhere. Shooting either of them now would create chaos that could destroy Kozlov's carefully orchestrated evening. They positioned themselves near the podium, where crystal chandeliers cast them in amber light, where 300 pairs of eyes could see every movement. She caught sight of Kozlov near the private wine cellar entrance, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, his expression frozen between fury and calculation. The shooters would need new orders. He needed seconds. He didn't have to respond to circumstances spiraling beyond his control. Before we begin, Leonard said, his voice cutting through the room's ambient noise, I'd like to introduce Linda Jackson, one of the youngest master sommeliers in the country and tonight's authentication expert. His tattooed hand rested at the small of her back, protective and possessive. Ms. Jackson has insights about the featured lots that I believe everyone should hear before bidding begins. The crowd murmured with interest. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing toward Kozlov for guidance that didn't come. Leonard had forced the play. Either Kozlov allowed Linda to speak, or he revealed his hand through obvious interference. Linda stepped forward, her composure absolute despite the red that had threatened Leonard's life minutes ago. The featured Bordeaux collection represents exceptional vintages from prestigious chateaus, she began, her voice carrying professional eloquence that commanded attention. The supposed 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc displays characteristics consistent with post-war French viticulture, complex tannin structure, remarkable preservation given the vintage year. She paused, letting the praise settle before delivering the strike. However, chemical analysis reveals synthetic compounds absent from legitimate pre-1950 wines. Specifically, polymer-based preservatives developed in the 1980s. Her eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Kozlov's rigid expression. This doesn't necessarily indicate forgery. It suggests documentation inconsistencies requiring independent verification before high-stakes purchases. The room erupted in whispered speculation. Leonard's hand tightened on her back, steady and reassuring. They'd change the board. Now they'd see if Kozlov had the courage to flip the table. Viktor Kozlov moved through the crowd with the measured grace of old-world sophistication, his silver hair catching light as he approached the podium. He was a man in his 50s who'd built an empire on the ability to mask ruthless calculation behind cultured charm. His smile never reached his eyes as he addressed the room, but his voice carried warmth that might have fooled anyone who hadn't seen what Linda had seen. "Ms. Jackson, thank you for your thorough analysis," he said, each word precisely calibrated. Though I wonder if perhaps the testing methodology itself introduced modern contamination. Chemical analysis can be remarkably sensitive to handling procedures. He turned to the crowd with a gesture that invited their agreement. A plausible explanation that warrants discussion before we draw premature conclusions. Leonard felt Linda tense beside him, but he stepped forward smoothly, his tattooed hand visible as he gestured toward her. Given Ms. Jackson's concerns and her impeccable reputation in the industry, perhaps independent verification would protect all parties' interests. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. Wealthy collectors deserve absolute certainty before spending millions on investments of this caliber. The crowd murmured agreement, heads nodding throughout the venue. No one wanted to be the fool who purchased a counterfeit vintage at 7 figures. Kozlov's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only crack in his composed exterior. "A reasonable suggestion," Kozlov said finally, his accent lending gravitas to what was clearly a forced retreat. "I propose we proceed with tonight's other lots while the featured Bordeaux collection undergoes additional authentication. We'll arrange independent verification that satisfies everyone's concerns." He smiled at the assembled guests, playing the role of responsible facilitator. "The integrity of this auction house has always been our highest priority." Applause rippled through the crowd, guests appreciating what they perceived as institutional responsibility. They had no idea they'd just witnessed a criminal enterprise interrupted by an unlikely alliance between a mafia boss and a sommelier with nothing left to lose. Linda's hand found Leonard's as they stepped back from the podium, her fingers cold despite the venue's warmth. "We're permanent targets now," she whispered. "He can't let us walk out of here alive." Leonard had already reached the same conclusion. Kozlov couldn't allow either of them to survive with the knowledge and evidence they possessed. This was no longer about money laundering or territory. This was about survival, theirs or his. No middle ground remained. The auction proceeded with remaining lots, the auctioneer's voice filling the space with practiced enthusiasm. But Leonard tracked Kozlov's position near the wine cellar entrance, noting how the silver-haired man's eyes never left them. The shooters were still positioned, mezzanine, wine cellar, coat check. Waiting for the moment they left the venue's public space and entered areas where violence could be executed without 300 witnesses. Leonard's phone vibrated against his ribs. A message from his head of security. 3 additional vehicles outside. Armed men. Blocking exits. Kozlov was preparing for every contingency. Tonight would end with bodies, or it would end with war. Leonard tightened his grip on Linda's hand, feeling her pulse racing beneath his fingers. "Stay close to me," he murmured. "We're not done yet." The auctioneer's voice rose with practiced enthusiasm as a rare Burgundy collection appeared on the display screen. 6 bottles of 1959 Romanée-Conti, their labels faded but intact, each one worth a small fortune. "We'll start the bidding at $200,000 for this exceptional collection." Linda leaned close to Leonard, her breath warm against his ear as paddles rose throughout the room. 2 lots ago sold to a paper corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. Another method of moving money through the auction. Her fingers tightened on his arm. Kozlov's operation runs deeper than just the featured lots. Leonard watched the bidding climb. 220,000, 250,000, 280,000. 2 buyers competed with the aggressive enthusiasm of people who either genuinely wanted the wines or had orders to acquire them regardless of price. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, ready to fall at 280,000. 350,000, Leonard said, his voice cutting through the room with the kind of authority that made conversations stop mid-sentence. Every head turned. The tattooed Mafia boss who'd exposed authentication fraud now participating in the auction itself. Guests exchanged glances, some knowing, others confused, all of them recognizing that something far more complex than wine appreciation was unfolding. The previous bidders lowered their paddles, either recognizing Leonard's reputation from tabloids and street rumors, or simply lacking resources to compete with someone whose wealth derived from decades of criminal enterprise. Kozlov's expression remained neutral from his position near the wine cellar, but Leonard caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand clenched briefly before relaxing. He couldn't refuse a legitimate bid without revealing the auction's true purpose. The social machinery that protected his operation also constrained his response. The auctioneer hesitated for only a moment. 350,000 to bidder 73. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell with finality that seemed to echo beyond its physical sound. Sold for $350,000. Polite applause rippled through the venue, though the energy felt different now, charged with speculation and unspoken questions. Leonard had just committed significant funds to a purchase serving no practical purpose beyond demonstrating his willingness to disrupt Kozlov's carefully orchestrated evening. He didn't need 6 bottles of Burgundy. He needed Kozlov to understand that every transaction tonight would be contested, that his money laundering operation had acquired an adversary with resources to match his own. Linda's hand found Leonard's arm, her touch brief but deliberate, conveying appreciation for the gesture that had bought them time and complicated Kozlov's calculations. "That was expensive disruption," she murmured. Leonard's tattooed fingers covered hers for a moment. "Consider it an investment in our survival." His eyes tracked Kozlov across the room, watching the silver-haired man's controlled fury barely masked beneath old-world charm. "He's running out of options. That makes him either more dangerous or more desperate." "Both," Linda said quietly. "Definitely both." The auction continued, but the room's atmosphere had shifted. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something more than competitive bidding, a confrontation playing out through proxy warfare over vintage wines, with stakes no one fully understood except the 3 people who knew tonight would end in violence or victory. The auctioneer's voice took on reverential tones as the final featured lot appeared on screen, a collection of rare champagnes, their bottles gleaming under carefully positioned lighting. From a private chateau cellar, ladies and gentlemen, 6 bottles of 1996 Dom Perignon Enotek, never released to market. We'll begin bidding at $300,000. Linda went rigid beside Leonard, her breath catching in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne's estimated value. Her hand moved to her phone with practice speed, fingers dancing across the screen as she accessed databases that most guests didn't know existed. When she angled the display toward Leonard, he saw images matching the bottles on stage, distinctive label variations, estate markings, authentication seals. These were reported stolen from Chateau de Montclair 2 years ago, she whispered urgently, her professional composure cracking for the first time since the red had appeared. Interpol has been tracking them through underground wine theft networks across 3 countries. Kozlov's operation isn't just money laundering, it's international organized crime with connections to theft rings in Europe. Leonard processed this with the speed of someone trained to identify leverage. International wine theft triggered treaties and cooperative law enforcement, far easier prosecution than complex money laundering charges requiring forensic accountants and years of investigation. One phone call to the right federal agent, and Kozlov's entire operation could collapse under the weight of international warrants. 400,000. A bidder called from the back. Leonard's voice cut through the room before the auctioneer could respond. 500,000. Silence rippled outward from his position. Kozlov's jaw clenched near the wine cellar entrance, his carefully maintained composure showing cracks that revealed the ruthless calculation beneath. His patience had been tested repeatedly tonight, first by Linda's authentication exposure, then by Leonard's burgundy bid. Now this direct challenge over stolen property that could destroy everything he'd built. The auctioneer waited for competing bids that didn't materialize. Previous bidders had withdrawn, recognizing they were witnessing something far more dangerous than enthusiastic collecting. Then Kozlov himself moved forward, breaking protocol by participating directly. 600,000. His voice carried across the venue with old-world authority, but his eyes locked on Leonard with undisguised hostility. He'd just revealed how much these champagnes mattered, enough to abandon his observer role and compete openly. Leonard didn't hesitate. 750,000. His tattooed hand remained steady on the bar, but his gaze held Kozlov's across the room in open challenge. The tension crackled between them like electricity before lightning, 2 criminal empires colliding over 6 bottles of stolen champagne that represented far more than vintage wine. This was territory, power, survival. This was war declared in front of 300 witnesses who didn't fully understand what they were seeing. Kozlov's expression went carefully blank as he calculated the attention continued escalation would draw. Federal agents monitored high-value auctions. Another bid would trigger scrutiny he couldn't afford, especially for bottles that Interpol was actively tracking. Sold to bidder 73 for $750,000, the auctioneer declared, his gavel falling with finality that seemed to reverberate beyond its physical sound. Leonard had just purchased evidence of international crime, and Kozlov knew it. Kozlov moved through the crowd with rigid control, his silver hair catching light as he approached their position near the bar. Every line of his body radiated barely contained fury, though his smile remained fixed in place, a predator maintaining social camouflage while calculating the kill. When he stopped before Leonard, his cultured accent carried venom beneath its polished surface. "Quite passionate bidding tonight, Mr. Bogue," he said, the words clipped despite their casual delivery. "I trust you're aware the auction house expects immediate payment verification for purchases of this magnitude. We wouldn't want any complications with fund transfers." Leonard met his gaze with the calm of someone who'd faced down threats from men far more dangerous than aging wine smugglers playing at sophistication. "I have funds ready for wire transfer within the hour," he replied, his tattooed hand visible as he adjusted his suit jacket. I'm looking forward to properly caring for wines that deserve legitimate ownership. The emphasis on legitimate landed like a blade between ribs, coded language communicating he knew exactly what he'd purchased and what it meant. Kozlov's smile tightened imperceptibly before he turned his attention to Linda, his eyes assessing her with a cold calculation of someone evaluating a problem requiring permanent solution. Ms. Jackson, perhaps we should schedule a meeting to discuss your chemical analysis methodology in detail. I'm certain there are variables in your testing procedures that warrant closer examination. The implied threat wasn't subtle, questioning her professional competence while reminding her of his reach, his resources, his ability to destroy careers and lives with equal efficiency. Linda held his gaze without flinching, her composure absolute despite the fear Leonard could feel radiating from her rigid posture. I maintain comprehensive records of all my testing procedures, Mr. Kozlov, she said, her voice steady and professional. I welcome peer review of my findings by any qualified sommelier or laboratory. Transparency benefits everyone invested in maintaining industry standards. Kozlov's jaw clenched briefly before he recovered his mask of old-world charm. Of course. Transparency. He inclined his head with exaggerated politeness that barely concealed rage simmering beneath the surface. Enjoy the remainder of your evening, both of you. He departed with measured steps, but Linda's hand found Leonard's arm immediately, her fingers digging in with urgency. That was temporary withdrawal, not surrender, she whispered. He'll move against us the moment we leave public space. The shooters are still positioned. I saw him signal toward the mezzanine. They're waiting for opportunity. Leonard's phone vibrated against his ribs. He pulled it out casually, angling the screen so Linda could see the message from his head of security. 3 additional vehicles outside. Armed men. Blocking primary exits. Heavy weapons. Kozlov wasn't just preparing for assassination anymore. He was preparing for war. Multiple contingencies, overwhelming force, enough firepower to ensure neither of them survived the night regardless of how many witnesses saw them leave together. He's committed now, Leonard said quietly, his mind already racing through extraction scenarios and defensive positions. We just became the biggest threat to his empire. He'll throw everything he has at eliminating us before we can deploy your evidence. Linda's hand trembled slightly on his arm. Then we'd better make sure we survive long enough to destroy him first. Leonard's hand moved to the small of Linda's back, guiding her toward the service corridor with a kind of casual confidence that suggested they were simply stepping out for privacy rather than fleeing an assassination attempt. His security team had already positioned themselves throughout the venue, 8 men who'd kept him alive through 2 decades of territorial wars and rival gang conflicts. They moved with military precision, creating a tactical perimeter that looked like nothing more than well-dressed guests shifting through the crowd. My team anticipated this, Leonard murmured, his lips close to Linda's ear as they navigated through clusters of socialites discussing tonight's unexpected drama. Alternate exits, armored vehicles staged 2 blocks north. I have a secure location in my territory, a penthouse with sightlines covering 4 blocks, security systems that would make government facilities jealous. We regroup there, deploy your evidence from a position of strength. Linda hesitated mid-step, her wine-red gown catching light from the chandeliers one final time before they entered the shadowed service corridor. The weight of what he was offering settled over her like physical pressure. Accepting Leonard's protection meant fully committing to partnership with a mafia boss, crossing a line she could never uncross. Her entire adult life had been built on legitimacy, professional credentials, the kind of respectability that opened doors in Manhattan's elite circles. Aligning herself with Leonard Bogue meant burning those bridges permanently. Her hand trembled as she reached for the wall, steadying herself against marble that felt cool beneath her fingers. 28 months of coerced complicity had already compromised her carefully constructed life. But this was different. This was choosing the darkness rather than being dragged into it. Leonard watched her internal struggle with eyes that had seen too many people break under pressure. He didn't rush her decision, didn't offer reassurances that would ring hollow given the reality they faced. Instead, he simply stood there, tattooed hands relaxed at his sides, his dark green suit absorbing the corridor's dim lighting, his entire presence radiating the kind of dangerous competence that came from surviving when smarter men had died. "I can't go back to who I was before tonight," Linda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even if we survive this, even if we destroy Kozlov, I'll never be just a sommelier again. The wine industry will remember that I authenticated counterfeits for 28 months, that I worked for a criminal enterprise." "No," Leonard agreed, his honesty brutal but necessary. "You'll be the woman who brought down an international money laundering operation. The expert who exposed wine fraud worth millions. The survivor who turned evidence against the syndicate that murdered her sister." He stepped closer, eliminating the distance between them. "You get to choose which story defines you. But you only get that choice if you're alive to make it." Linda nodded slowly, the decision settling across her features with something approaching peace. Not happiness. The circumstances didn't allow for that, but the calm that came from finally stopping the exhausting performance of pretending strength meant carrying everything alone. She'd been fighting in isolation since her sister's death 8 months ago, gathering evidence while maintaining her professional facade, planning revenge that would likely end in her own death. But Leonard offered something different.
Partnership.
Shared danger transforming into shared survival. They moved through the service corridor where kitchen staff worked with focused intensity, too busy with catering duties to notice a Mafia boss and a sommelier slipping past. Leonard's security team materialized from various positions: a bartender who wasn't actually employed by the venue, 2 supposed maintenance workers, a valet who'd been tracking vehicle movements all evening. They formed a tactical escort without breaking stride, their movements so coordinated they might have been choreographed. The service exit opened onto an alley, where Manhattan's October night hit them with autumn chill that cut through evening wear designed for climate-controlled venues. Linda's breath misted in the air, her gown offering no protection against wind that smelled of distant rain and the city's perpetual blend of exhaust and ambition. 3 black SUVs idled with engines running, their windows tinted dark enough to suggest armored glass. Doors opened before they reached the vehicles, Leonard's security team moving with the kind of precision that came from years of operating in hostile territory. Linda started toward the lead SUV, her heels clicking against wet pavement, when something made her stop. Not fear exactly, though fear certainly threaded through everything tonight had become, but rather the sudden recognition that this moment marked an irrevocable transformation. She turned back toward Leonard, who stood framed against the service entrance's dim light, his tattooed neck visible where his collar had shifted during their movement through the corridor. Her hand rose almost of its own accord, hovering near his throat where rose tattoos climbed toward his jaw. She didn't quite touch him, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin, to see his pulse beating steady despite the adrenaline that must be coursing through both of them. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice carrying exhaustion from 28 months of forced complicity and 8 months of solitary revenge planning that had finally manifested in tonight's confrontation. "I don't know if we survive what's coming, if Kozlov destroys us before we can deploy the evidence, if federal agents will arrest us both for crimes we've committed in different contexts." Her eyes searched his face, looking for deception or manipulation, and finding instead something she hadn't expected: genuine uncertainty. "But I know I can't do this alone anymore." Leonard saw in her expression the same isolation he'd felt throughout 2 decades of building a criminal empire that required trusting no one, maintaining emotional distance as the price of survival. Every person who'd gotten close had either betrayed him or died, sometimes both. He'd learned early that power couldn't coexist with vulnerability, that caring about someone created weaknesses enemies would exploit without hesitation. But standing here with a woman who understood the weight of choices made under impossible circumstances, who'd spent 28 months living with the same grinding pressure of coerced complicity, he recognized the possibility for something different. Not redemption. His crimes precluded that fantasy, but genuine connection with someone who wouldn't flinch from the reality of who he was and what he'd done to survive. He stepped closer, eliminating the final distance between them. His tattooed hand rose to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with surprising gentleness from fingers that had ended lives with calculated efficiency. Around them, his security team maintained vigilant watch, scanning rooftops and alley entrances for threats, but at this moment, only the two of them existed. The red laser that had threatened his life had become the catalyst for something neither of them had sought. Linda had warned him because tactical alliance offered better survival odds than dying alone. But what had started as mutual desperation was transforming into something far more dangerous than Kozlov's shooters. Actual trust between two people who'd learned that isolation was the only reliable defense against a world that punished vulnerability. "Stay," Leonard whispered, the single word carrying more weight than elaborate speeches could ever convey. It was vulnerability he rarely allowed himself, a man who'd built power through violence and control, now asking rather than commanding. His reputation had been forged through ruthlessness, through making examples of people who challenged his authority, through 2 decades of ensuring that fear kept him safe when loyalty proved temporary. But Linda had seen the calculation in his eyes when he'd bid $750,000 for stolen champagne. She'd felt his tactical mind working when he'd positioned them in maximum visibility to complicate assassination attempts. She knew he was dangerous, knew his empire was built on crimes that would horrify the wine collectors she'd spent years cultivating relationships with. And yet here, with his thumb gentle against her cheek and his eyes searching hers with something approaching desperate hope, he was simply a man who'd survived by being alone, asking someone to choose connection over safety. "Please," he added, and that second word transformed everything. Not demand, not seduction, not manipulation, just honest request from someone who'd forgotten how to ask for anything he couldn't take by force. Linda's eyes searched his face for long seconds that felt suspended outside normal time. She found scars there, evidence of a violent life marked permanently on skin that would never be smooth again. The small tattoo beneath his right eye that marked him as belonging to a world she'd once existed completely separate from. The intensity in his gaze that came from constant vigilance, from expecting betrayal because experience had taught him that trust was a luxury that got people killed. But she also found something else, genuine vulnerability, the kind that required more courage than any physical confrontation. He was offering partnership, asking her to stay knowing that she'd witnessed his tactical mind calculating survival strategies, knowing that she understood exactly what kind of man he was and what he'd done to build the empire that gave him resources to fight Kozlov's organization. Her hand settled against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat beneath expensive fabric and layers of scar tissue from knife fights and bullet wounds, the accumulated evidence of 2 decades surviving in a world that killed slower men. His pulse was steady despite the adrenaline, despite the assassination attempt they'd just disrupted, despite offering vulnerability to someone who could destroy him more completely than any rival gang ever had. "Okay," Linda said quietly, the word barely audible above the wind that swept through the alley carrying the scent of approaching rain. "I'll stay." Something shifted in Leonard's expression. Not quite relief, because men like him couldn't afford that luxury, but perhaps the closest approximation his carefully controlled features could manage. His hand slid from her face to the back of her neck, pulling her closer until her forehead rested against his, their breath mingling in the cold air. They stood like that for 3 heartbeats, suspended between the violence of the wine gala behind them and the unknown battles waiting ahead. Then Leonard's security team leader cleared his throat softly, a reminder that tactical necessity required movement even when emotion demanded stillness. Leonard's arms settled around Linda's shoulders as they moved toward the lead SUV, her body fitting against his side with surprising naturalness. She'd never imagined herself finding comfort in a mafia boss's protective embrace, never thought she'd willingly enter an armored vehicle surrounded by armed men whose loyalty was bought with criminal proceeds. But desperation and shared danger had a way of redrawing boundaries that once seemed absolute. The vehicle's interior smelled of leather and gun oil, the scent marking it clearly as transportation for someone who lived with constant threat. Linda slid across the seat, Leonard following close enough that his thigh pressed against hers, his tattooed hand finding hers in the darkness. His security team arranged themselves between the 3 SUVs with tactical efficiency, creating a defensive convoy that could respond to attacks from multiple vectors. As the vehicles pulled out of the alley, Linda caught one final glimpse of the Diamond Hall's elegant facade through tinted windows. Crystal chandeliers still glowed through tall windows where guests continued their evening, unaware that they'd witnessed a criminal empire's disruption. Kozlov would be inside calculating his next move, fury burning beneath his cultured exterior, planning violence that would make tonight's assassination attempt look restrained. But Linda wasn't alone anymore. The evidence she'd gathered over 28 months would be deployed from a position of strength rather than martyrdom. Her sister's murder would be avenged not through solitary sacrifice, but through strategic warfare waged alongside someone who understood that survival required ruthlessness tempered with unexpected moments of humanity. Leonard's thumb traced circles against her palm, the gesture absent-minded but intimate. She turned toward him in the darkness, finding his profile illuminated by passing streetlights that cast moving shadows across his tattooed features. He looked like what he was, dangerous, scarred, marked permanently by violence. But when his eyes met hers, she saw the vulnerability he'd allowed her to witness, the genuine request that had transformed their tactical alliance into something approaching actual connection. "Whatever happens next," Linda said quietly, her words meant only for him despite his security team's presence in the front seats, "we face it together." Leonard's hand tightened on hers, his response unnecessary because they both understood the commitment they'd just made. Not love. The circumstances didn't allow for that kind of clean emotion, but partnership forged in shared danger and mutual recognition of each other's strengths and damages. The SUV accelerated into Manhattan's night traffic, carrying them toward Leonard's secure territory, where they'd transform from hunted targets into active threats. Behind them, Kozlov's empire continued operating with the confidence of an organization that had survived years without serious challenge. But tonight had introduced variables he hadn't calculated, a sommelier who'd turned evidence gathering into prosecutable warfare, and a mafia boss willing to burn significant resources protecting someone who'd warned him about a red that should have ended his life. The city's lights blurred past tinted windows as they drove north, leaving the Diamond District's refined elegance for Leonard's territory, where survival mattered more than sophistication. Linda leaned against Leonard's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline as the immediate danger receded into planning for battles still ahead. She felt his arm tighten around her, protective and possessive in ways that should have concerned her, but instead felt like the first real security she'd known since her sister's murder 8 months ago. The red, that had appeared on Leonard's temple had been meant to end his life. Instead, it had catalyzed something neither of them expected. Genuine connection between two people who'd learned that isolation was the only defense against a world that punished vulnerability. But desperation had taught them both that survival without connection was just slow death by another name. And if they were going to die fighting Kozlov's empire, at least they'd die knowing they'd tried something different than the solitary existence they'd both accepted as necessary. Leonard's lips brushed her hair, the gesture so subtle his security team probably didn't notice. But Linda felt it, felt the weight of everything it meant: promise and protection, partnership, and something approaching tenderness from a man whose reputation was built on ruthlessness. Whatever came next, federal investigations, Kozlov's retaliation, the wine industry's judgment, they'd face it together. The laser sight that threatened death had become the catalyst for life. Real connection replacing hollow survival. Two damaged people choosing partnership over isolation, vulnerability over armor, trust over the safety of emotional distance. The SUV turned onto a street Linda didn't recognize, heading toward Leonard's territory and the battles waiting there. But suspended between past trauma and future uncertainty, she'd found something worth fighting for beyond revenge and survival. She'd found someone who understood that strength sometimes meant asking for help. That power couldn't substitute for connection. That surviving meant more than simply refusing to die. It meant finding reasons that made survival feel worth the effort required to achieve it. Leonard's tattooed hand covered hers completely, his pulse steady against her wrist. Outside, Manhattan's night continued with relentless momentum, indifferent to the small moment of vulnerability passing in an armored SUV. But inside, two people who'd learned to trust no one were learning to trust each other. And in a world that punished such vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency, that choice represented courage more profound than any violence they'd commit in the battles ahead. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So, do check it out.